Tonight, the Booksmith is very pleased to once again welcome David Thomson, this time for a talk and book signing to celebrate the publication of Have You Seen? A Personal Introduction to 1000 Films. Like all of you, I love movies. And not only do I like watching films, I also love film culture. I enjoy reading about the movies and reading the literature of film. Have You Seen? David Thomson's 21st book is a quite large treasure chest of idiosyncratic, energetic, authoritative, provocative, short, sharp essays. There are sentences and passages here that will bowl you over, and others that will cause you to exclaim and disagree. That was its effects on me. Companionable to the author's biographical dictionary of film, Have You Seen is like that earlier book, a monumental achievement. In the words of the noted film critic Richard Schickel, it belongs on the, quote, very short shelf of truly worthwhile books about the movies. Over the last decade, I've had the pleasure of hosting events with numerous film writers, critics, historians, biographers, actors, directors, archivists, and journalists. Of all those who write about film today, few offer such thoughtful, entertaining, and adroitly wrought words on the medium as does tonight's author. David Thomson is one of those film writers one loves to read, and, I might add, to hear speak. Please welcome David Thomson.
Well, thank you so much. There seem to be a lot these days. I can actually remember, I'm old enough to remember, when there were hardly any film books. It's not that long ago, actually, in the late 1950s, when I was trying to find out everything I could about film. There were hardly any books in the English language that you could read about film. And it was only in the late 60s that they began to creep in. And I sometimes wonder, on disheartened days, whether there is a graph that goes in parallel between the decline of movie-going and the rise of books about film. But then I think, no, this can't be so, and I move on. One of the things that people always tell me, and I've come around to agree, is that I have a wonderful time. Now, you know, we're not raised always to think we have a wonderful time. We think we're actually hard done by a lot of the time. But people look at me and they say, you watch films, you watch them again, you talk about them, you write about them. What could be more fun? What could be easier, they say? And what could be more delightful? Because after all, isn't it true, everyone loves the films. After all, there are a few subjects like sport, like sex, like money, and films, many of them draining away before your very eyes, that everybody likes to talk about. And I say, well, it's true, and it does mean that wherever you are, you can strike up a conversation about film. If I were to come before you tonight, and if I had been introduced tonight as one of the neurological authorities in the world, and if I happen to look out, and I'm not going to pick on any one of you, but if I happen to take one of you aside later and say, sir, madam, I couldn't help but notice a little tremor under one eye, and I don't want to alarm you at all, but it's been my experience. Well, let's just say this. I think a thorough CAT scan quickly, like within half an hour, would be an entirely sensible procedure. Chances are you're going to do it because neurology is one of those profound, infinite, but very difficult subjects that we all believe in but know hardly anything about, but we know that it's part of us. And if an expert tells you you need help, you'll go for the help. But if I come before you as an expert on film, and if I manage to provoke one of you into defending, oh, say, The Sound of Music, it could be a lot of other films, but if I get one of you to stand up and say, well, I really think The Sound of Music is one of the greatest films ever made. And if I then launch into, which I probably could if I worked myself up to it, I could have done once upon a time, I know, into an eloquent, logical, coherent, utterly damning routing of The Sound of Music, you'd look at me with justified indignation and you'd say, well, you're wrong. I'm right. I know what I think. In other words, we are all film critics. If later tonight or tomorrow night, whatever, you go to see Milk or whatever, you're going to have an opinion about it. And thank God you are. And unless you're very insecure and that tremor under the eye has gone a little deeper than any of us want to think about, you'll hold by your opinion, even if in the New York Times, say, or San Francisco Chronicle, esteemed critics take a quite opposite line on your film. And I think this is really one of the greatest virtues about film study that there is. I used to teach film for about 10 years, hugely enjoyable. Once I had convinced the class that although I was going to give them a grade at the end of the term, I was in no sense a reliable authority, and that all I wanted them to do was to start to talk about the film as they had seen it, as they felt it, so that others would join in the conversation. And we would have an argument going, a discussion, because for me the purpose of film appreciation classes was more or less to get the students to describe and define their feelings more fully perhaps than they had done at the beginning of the term. It was no more complicated than that. And that there certainly was not a pantheon anywhere that contained the films that are great, saved, timeless, landmarks, eternal. The pantheon exists in all of our heads. And if you like The Sound of Music, or The Flame and the Arrow, a film that you may not have heard of, worth seeing. And if you like it above all other films, that is absolutely fine. All you would have had to do on my class in the end to get a good grade was to write a reasonably decent paper saying why you like The Flame and the Arrow. And as I grow older, I feel it's more and more important to hold to that code. It's not the job of people like me to spoil your enjoyment, as if I could. Because the enjoyment at the movies really too far from those very private enjoyments like sexual enjoyment. And we don't need to be told whether our sexual enjoyment rates highly in any schools of sexual enjoyment. It's ours. It's what we have managed to obtain. We may know in our heart of hearts that it may not be the best in the world or in all possible worlds, but it was the best we could get. And we are ordinary and human and decent, and the best you can get is pretty good. It's better than nothing. And I think that the same sort of thing applies about films. Now, of course, I don't think that necessarily all of us want to talk about our sexual enjoyment, although a lot more people do than used to. But when it comes to films, you go to dinner parties, you go to parties, you sit down in Starbucks, and one of the easiest things to get into conversation over is, have you seen Milk? Or whatever. And you can make friends. You sometimes are on the road to sexual enjoyment in conversations that begin by being about film. Not too many of us, I think, have had long-term relationships that didn't at one time involve going to the movies together. You know, and anyone who works in a movie theater knows that film study is not the only thing that goes on there. There are many other things happening, and that's one of the reasons why it's dark inside. So, if I am so broad-minded about it, and so tolerant, and so open to you thinking what you want to think, how do I justify a book like this, which is 1,000 films I have chosen to offer to you, with about 500 words on each film, telling you various things about it. We might get into some of that a bit later. But how do I justify a stance that seems to be so, not aggressive, but so interested in shaping the way you're thinking? It seems inconsistent. And it may be, but here's the point, and this is really what led to this book. I've taught film, I've seen a great many films, and my parents told me it was a mistake and I should control it, but I never learned to control it. And by the age of 67, you might just as well go with it, because it's the only remote chance of earning a living that I possess. So I see more films, not less. And I'm still as interested in thinking about them and talking about them and writing about them as ever I was. And this book here is a testament to film, but it's a testament to writing too. I could write about a lot of different things. I have written about several different things. And film is the most available to me. It's the most available pretext for writing. And in part it's the most workable pretext because it's the thing that I know a little bit about that most people are interested in. I could write about sport, but you see, I was raised in England. So I know English sports inside out. And I could write books about soccer, but it's not going to mean too much to people over here. Not at the moment. In 50 years' time, maybe. But one thing happens to me all the time. And it may be because people just simply don't know what else to talk to me about. And you know, that's a thing in life. You sit next to somebody at a party or on a bus, and you don't always know what to say. But people have heard that I've spent a lot of time seeing films, or they know, or one way or another. And they say, now, tell me, Mr. Thompson, or tell me, David, I love the movies myself, they will say. And I see quite a lot. Not as much as you, I'm sure, but quite a lot. And I go to the video store, I go to the video. I'm serious, I don't just deal with some trashy video store on the corner. I go to Le Video, as I hope many of you do, because I know it's the best in town. And I subscribe to Netflix, and I've got some friends who've got private collections, but still, I'm often in a dilemma, and I go to the video, and I think, let's get a couple of things for the weekend. And I start to look around those shelves, and I become intimidated because I see more and more titles, a lot of which I've heard of, a lot of which I haven't heard of. And I end up almost paralyzed. I don't know what to pick. Now I know, as more and more people will say to me, that the new films are not necessarily the films I'm going to enjoy seeing. A lot of very enthusiastic filmgoers feel about the new films as I often do, which is to say that not enough of them are good enough for us. And in other words, people are happily falling back on the older films. Now, there are prejudices. You hear about kids who don't believe a movie is a movie if it's not in color, or if it's silent. But it's my experience that those prejudices can be handled. I have sometimes tied a son to the sofa and shown him dry as the Passion of Joan of Arc. And he's been close to tears by the end of the film. And that's black and white, and it's silent. It's 1927. It's still one of the great films ever made. When critics get together, not that we necessarily worship or admire critics, but when they get together and think, let's vote on the 10 best films ever made, it's very often in the list of films they come up with. What people most need, I find, is the confidence to span what is an increasingly difficult field to contain. Because when you go to the video, you see films from countries you've barely heard of, let alone seen the films from that country. And you realize that film is now over 100 years old. When I tell you what is the absolute truth, which is that as a collective culture, we have probably lost for all time more than half the films ever made, you realize how many films have been made in the 100 years. Now, cinema has always had a profound natural association with trash. The instantaneous, the thing you'll see tonight, the sensational, the lurid, the awful, the indecent sometimes, the horrific, the scandalous, films that are not made to last. And I'm not totally against trashiness because I think it's a natural part of the medium, but it's also the truth that over the 100 years or so, some extraordinarily talented, dedicated, inspired people, take your pick, Fritz Lang in Germany, Ingmar Bergman in Sweden, Orson Welles, Preston Sturges in America, David Lean in England, Michael Powell in England. Those people have tried to make films that might be as good as, let's say, the best novels of your year, the best pieces of new music, the best pictures painted. We don't need to get into the question of whether film is an art like the other arts. I prefer the notion that it's an art just like itself. But I think most of us know that there are films that have moved us in our lifetime as much as nearly anything else we've ever seen. And films that continue to do so over the years, over the decades. In other words, there is enormous value there. And this book is meant as nothing more complicated than a guide for you at the video store or when you're dealing with Netflix or whatever, that introduces you to films that you've never seen, may never have heard of. Now, you've got to embark upon a little bit of trust with me, as if I were a neurologist. But you can tell that I'm trustworthy, can't you? Yes. And if you read the book, I think you will find above all, I'm enthusiastic. I think as you read the book, you'll begin to say, and this is really the secret to film writing, oh, I want to see that. And before you get to the end of the 500 words on a particular film, you may be out the door, searching for it. That's what I really want from this book. And above all, I want you people to have more fun. Now, when I wrote the book, when I set out to write the book, I did not foresee that I might be here in a time and a world where fun suddenly became a much more precious thing than it is. But it may well be that we are going to have to find our fun in just a few hardened places. It's not going to be quite the same as it has been in those happy spendthrift days. In which case, there are not many better ways of spending a weekend. Certainly not many cheaper ways of spending the weekend than what it costs to rent a couple of films. In which case, the initial investment in this book, sizable as it is, but the book is sizable too, is a small part of the pleasure that I hope lies ahead for you. Nothing pleases me more than seeing a newcomer open this book and say out loud, half these films I haven't heard of. That's a measure of what awaits you. Now, I suspect when you get into it, certainly if you're old enough, you have heard of or you vaguely remember a few more than you think. But there is already in the culture of film a terrible forgetfulness and the ignorance of, say, The Passion of Joan of Arc, a film I may have mentioned for the first time in some of your lives earlier this evening. But the fact that you don't know about that film is a sadness. What's happy is that it can be remedied. It's a film that even bad video stores usually stock nowadays because it is actually so well known, so famous a film at its level. Most of the films in this book you can find at a store like the Video. Some of them you can't. And since we all live in San Francisco or the Bay Area, you can even give me a call if you have trouble with some of them. And I'm prepared to dig out copies of certain things for individuals who really have the taste and the hunger for them. So it's a guidebook. Now it's also a sort of autobiography. It's how I've spent my life. And if you read the whole book, which would take a long time, and there is no way to read this in a proper order. The book is in alphabetical order, but the way to read the book is to dip and skip and move sideways and that kind of thing. But as you do it, you'll get a portrait of what it is and has been to be mad about film in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I realized that when I had finished the book, that I probably had never done anything that is so complete a confessional. Because, you know, religions tell you that confession is for guilt. Well, I'm against guilt on the whole. I think confessions are for pleasure. Just think of confession in any known religion. What you had to do was go into the booth or whatever, you know, and tell about the greatest pleasure you'd had this week, I think the world might work better. I seriously do. I think there's a lot of potential in it. I don't love every film in this book because I decided early on that if it was 1,000 raves, which it could easily have been, there's a danger of that being monotonous. So I threw in some films that I knew were going to come up in any conversation about this book, if only because I had omitted it, like The Sound of Music, which is in here, worth the price of admission in itself, because I tell you in 500 words why I think it's so awful. And there's some other films that I tell you why I think they're so awful. I know you can handle that, because we've been through over this ground before. You know what you like, and you're not going to be shaken by it. So that's what the book is, that's what the book is about. And I thought I'd read you a couple of entries to give you just a flavor of it, and then we'll throw it open to questions and whatever else there might be, and see how we go from there. To Be or Not to Be, 1942. The point may be obvious. It may gloss over fine issues of taste, but in some total conflict, if one side is making to be or not to be in the middle of a war, and the other is not, you know which side to root for. No, there are no Nazi equivalents to this film. No film in which the Goethe Institute, let's say, sends a Schubert leader singer on a tour of the United States, and she tries to conduct an affair with a spokesman for the Bund. You're tempted by the sound of that, but only because you've grown up in a culture addicted to irony, sarcasm, self-effacement, and that essential ingredient of American acting, once identified by Kenneth Tynan, its Jewishness. It has to be said that Samson Raphaelson, Ernst Lubitsch's preferred writer, chose to be unavailable for this project because he feared that it would end in charges of bad taste. So Melchior Lengyel shaped the idea, and Edwin Justus Meyer wrote the script about a Polish acting company in Nazi-occupied Warsaw that has a hard time doing Hamlet, but which gets drawn into a masquerade against the Nazis that may help win the war. This is the company led by Maria and Joseph Tudor, Carol Lombard and Jack Benny. When he is doing Hamlet and she has a Polish flyer after her, and she tells the boy to rendezvous in her dressing room just after her husband begins the speech, to be or not to be. What follows is nothing less than a farce in which the Nazis are the butt of the humor, but in which, so they call me concentration camp Erhard, do they, is relied upon to get repeated belly laughs. Some find it too much. I suggest that its brilliance lies in the concentration on actors at the heart of the story and the casting genius that saw how far the already wounded face of Jack Benny could consider no greater crime against humanity than walking out on his big speech. And then there is Carol Lombard, ravishing, sexy, happy, and glorious in her gowns. She was dead shortly after the film finished shooting, and it may be that that took away from audience numbers as much as any question of taste. Alexander Korda was a co-producer on the venture, and Vincent Korda did the sets. Those gowns are by Irene, and Rudolf Matte did the photography. The faultless cast also includes Robert Stack, Felix Bressart, Lionel Atwill, Stanley Ridges, Sig Ruman, and Charles Horton. Of course, it is an artifice, protected from the real horror of war. But it has moments when to see the Turies, vain, self-centered, essentially small-minded, is still to recognize how far cinema and egalitarianism can amount to models of ordinary decency. The American cinema has made few lastingly useful political statements, and it has often taken fright at the risk of trying. To Be or Not to Be is the sort of film that would have earned murder gangs if the other side had won. It is still brave, and it still bespeaks a wholesome insolence in many Americans towards tyranny and the way of life ready to rationalize the death of flirtation. One of the great American films, made by a German. As so often the case, film is international. Now let me read about a foreign film, whatever a foreign film is. I have more and more trouble defining what a foreign film is in an age when internationalism is becoming so exciting and so important. Everyone thought Seven Samurai, when it opened in 1954, was a foreign film, a Japanese film. Japanese films are regarded as being exotic in those days. Many people still think they are. But when the director came to Europe with the film, Akira Kurosawa, and he was asked how this film related to the culture of the samurai in Japan, he said, well, it is so, but I love the John Ford films too. And I was trying to make a Japanese John Ford film. So internationalism, I'm not sure. Anyway, here is one of the most famous foreign films, non-American films, black and white. Probably a lot of you have seen it because it is so famous. But if you haven't seen it, could be the first film on your list. In 16th century Japan, an idyllic village in a valley below steep mountains discovers that bandits will attack as soon as the barley crop is ripe. The village has suffered before. Should it yield again or fight back? A small committee is appointed to find samurai who will defend them. This is a long film, drawn out by a master of suspense and control, over 200 minutes in its full version. We meet the seven samurai. We see them living in the village, doing their best to train the farmers and work out a strategy. And then there is battle, begun in sunlight and ending in pouring rain. Why seven? The film is over 50 years old now, and it is impossible for anyone to see it today without thinking of the traditions it inspired, not just the Magnificent Seven and the Sergio Leone pictures, not just the immense field of martial arts films based on the Western fascination with samurai armor and Japanese discipline, not just Jean-Pierre Melville's Le Samurai or John Frankenheimer's Ronin, but the laser beam sword battles of the Star Wars series. George Lucas was a huge admirer of Akira Kurosawa and the eventual co-producer on his Kagemusha. Yet I urge you to do your best to regard this film with the eyes of 1954, to see the astonishing vigor from Kurosawa that goes into every frame and meeting. I suspect that by the time he made Seven Samurai, he was well aware of and much in love with tropes from the American Western, but then considered the things that are uniquely his. the restless camera movements, the urge like that of a mettlesome horse to be galloping and moving, the intense burning close-ups, and the way in which the cadet samurai can look at the weary master and say, "You are simply great," and we feel the justice of it, but understand the sad smile on the master's face. There are the lovers on the forest floor, spread-eagled and surrounded by wild flowers. There is the terrible look on the face of the kidnapped wife as she realizes her husband is about to rescue her. There is the sudden use of slow motion, so that you wonder if you really saw it, and the sounds of running water, of bird cries, of the wind, and of Toshiro Mifune's snorts of derision for everyone, himself included. These images and sounds are like moments in Shakespeare. You can say that the film was a canny attempt to win Western audiences, and it undoubtedly achieved that. But over 50 years later, you could marvel at the rich black and white, the natural sounds, the drum beats, the hooves on the ground, and the music. It is a landmark in action films, but in its treatment of heroism, too. These samurai work, and some of them die, for mere food. You wonder if they may seize the village or be turned on by the villagers, for there is not too much trust between those parties. But the integrity of the contract prevails. There has always been a vein of cinema in which people do the right thing. And Seven Samurai comes as that notion was being treated with cynicism. But there is no denying or forgetting the faces of these men. They are the Seven Samurai, and they have found themselves. They do not need to say so, because we understand it. So, be happy to take any questions and any comments or any thoughts about matters raised. Yes, sir.
I have a question that I was reminded of by the introduction mentioning Richard Schickel. I'd love to know your impression of the film performance with Mick Jagger and James Fox from about 40 years ago. And the reason I mention it, and you may be aware of this, I think it's the only review I've ever seen in which a writer said, "I'm going out on a limb and say, this is the worst movie ever made."
Well, Richard Schickel is someone I've known a long time, and I think we would both regard each other as friends, and I've learned to live with the fact that he can be mistaken. Performance, there'll be some people here who don't know performance, and so I'll tell you very briefly. It is a film in which a gangster on the run in London, played by James Fox, takes refuge in a sort of nearly ghostly house in Notting Hill, which is the hideout for a reclusive rock singer, played by Mick Jagger. Does that convey the film reasonably adequately? Yeah.
Except you left out Anita Pallenberg.
Well, I've never known how to talk about Anita Pallenberg. But, well, there's a whole lot of sex and drugs in the film too. It was made at a moment, it sort of represents, in some ways it is the epitome of swinging London at that time. It was made by two men, the cameraman, Nicholas Rogue, who became a director, and a very strange figure named Donald Camel, who was an ideas man. And it was straight away a subject of immense notoriety because Warner Brothers, who had put up the money for it, were so bewildered by the film that they thought they had to recut it. They tried recutting it and they could get no more sense in it. And so it got released. And it is a genuine cult film. It's not to everybody's taste. I'm very fond of it. I like it a great deal and I would recommend it. And I can think of so many films that are so worse. I mean, for me, dullness is always the worst thing in the cinema, I think, you know. And performance is not dull. I don't think many people would come away and say performance is a flat-out masterpiece, although there are some who have. But I think most people would come away glad they saw it and taken by it. And Anita Pallenberg was a very attractive woman who wore hardly anything throughout most of the film. There are many scenes of the leading characters bathing together, I remember. What is really interesting about the film, I think, is that the man behind it really was Donald Cammell, who was a great friend of Marlon Brando's. And it was meant to be Brando and Mick Jagger. But as so often in his career, Brando dropped out, trailed away. So James Fox took over. And another interesting story. James Fox, who'd made several films, he is the young man in The Servant, if you remember. He's a very good actor. He was so thoroughly disturbed by the process of making the film that he retired from acting for about 10 years and went away to serve in a religious mission. Now, please don't laugh. I mean, religious missions need people, and you know, he is a very sincere and earnest man, and he believed he had scraped the bottom of the barrel, I think, in making that film, and went away thereafter. Performance is in this book, however, and it's certainly a film I would urge you to find. You will not have too much difficulty finding it either. It's available. Yes, ma'am.
Well, at the risk of sounding like a complete downer, I don't watch videos. In fact, I don't have a TV. I've never had a TV, and I can count the number of videos I've seen probably on both hands, and I've been pretty much physically coerced into watching them every time by other people who insist on doing that, but I've never really enjoyed watching anything on video. So I consider myself extremely fortunate to have lived in New York City during the heyday of the repertory theaters, and I just got the most amazing film education through doing that. You speak. Out here, I just want to, sorry.
No.
You just mentioned The Passion of Joan of Arc. They just showed it at the Castro last week with a 200-person choir from UC Berkeley, the alumni choir, and an original oratorio, and then showed it again at UC Berkeley. I went to both performances. I cried like a baby.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I've never been so moved by a movie in my life. So I am really sad that the rise of video has sort of robbed people of these experiences, robbed businesses like the Castro.
I could not agree with you more, and it is the great dilemma people like me find ourselves in. Video is extraordinarily useful if you do the kind of work I'm doing. You've had a great opportunity, because of where you live maybe, to see The Passion of Joan of Arc in I would say probably ideal circumstances. But you know, all over the world, there are people who are not within reach of a theater any longer. Not a single theater. And in this economy, that's only going to grow worse. You can expect to see theater closures such as you can't believe. The Castro has come close to that before. Castro is a monument. I mean, literally, it is legally defined as a monument, so it is protected in certain ways. But you can imagine how expensive the Castro is to operate. I think every movie should be seen on a big screen with a screen 30 feet high, ideally in a packed crowd of strangers. It should all be like my childhood. You know, and I am lucky enough to be of an age that I started film going when there were still theaters in London, where I was, crazily decorated buildings, all part of the atmosphere of it. We have one or two here, quite pale versions of what theatres used to be like, but still quite something. And I urge everyone, if any time they have the opportunity to see a film in good circumstances, to see it that way. And there are places in the Bay Area, like the Pacific Film Archive, let's say, you know, where you have the opportunity to see the best prints anyone can get hold of. And there are even one or two commercial venues like the Castro, where you can see those things. And I agree with you, film is not the same on video. But do you believe that you and I are going to stand in the way of this rush? You're a young woman. You will live long enough to buy a television set. Yes, yes, sir.
There was a Spanish film that just it's about 6 years old, called Kilometro Zero.
Yes.
And I've always only read European reviews. I've never read an American review of the
I don't think it opened here, did it?
Well,
Did you see it here?
I saw it on Netflix.
Yeah, but did it have a commercial theatrical opening in this country?
I think so. It didn't. I was living in St. Louis at the time. It was at the American Theater.
Ah. Was that a commercial release, or was that just a single screening, perhaps, at a special theater?
No,
Not the same.
it's more like the American Theater is like Newark down in
Yeah,
Los Angeles.
yeah.
It's basically an art theater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about is let me put it this way: in the great surge of film education that occurred in the 60s and the 70s, there was a very substantial American audience for foreign language subtitled films. That has gone into drastic retreat. There are a lot of very fine films made overseas that do not come to this country anymore, and that's why, and again, San Francisco is a beneficiary. That's why I think like the San Francisco Film Festival, and if you live in a city, you know, where there are one or two really good film festivals, you can catch up with them if you know what you're looking for. But yes, it is hard to see them, because to bring a film, a foreign language film here, you've got, first of all, to do the subtitling, quite an expensive operation. You've got to spend a certain amount to market it. And I'm afraid there are no longer enough people who believe that is a viable concern. I'm speaking about a year ago. As for now, I think, you know, again, we're going to find ourselves suddenly short of a lot of things.
I
And
found the film very interesting.
I haven't seen it, but I'm sure you're right, and I will look for it myself. But I will assure everyone that every year there are at least a dozen films of high quality that do not come to this country, and therefore become difficult to see. Now, video is one way they can come more cheaply, but still, it's a problem. But you know, I don't wish to say anything too doomy, but you could lose bookstores too. You could lose newspapers. You could lose an awful lot of the things that I think are taken for granted and absolutely vital to the sustenance of an intelligent culture. And films are there, they're in it, but they're just